I'm sure you all can imagine what a treat it is to be introduced by somebody whom you've known for 30 years and very closely. It's very sweet. So I'm delighted to be here. Very pleased to see so many of you back. This, of course, is a very special day for intervention. Mr. Gaddafi was killed this morning under typically gruesome circumstances, as such things will go. But to me, there were two iconic media events. One was on NBC, and there they showed some celebrating NTC rebels, now the future army or government of Libya. And of course, as rebels do in many parts of the world, they were shooting their guns off in the air as part of celebration. And one guy walks up with a very long, looked like a .30 caliber machine gun, and he gets in front of the NBC cameraman. You can see him posing, lifts up the gun, pulls the trigger, and nothing happens. He couldn't get the gun to work. So he puts it down, and a bunch of his fellows come, and they all gather around trying to get the gun to work. To me, that was emblematic of these rebels. That's one emblematic part of it. The second, however, was another shot, and this is of the guy who may, we don't know the full story, actually have participated in the execution of Mr. Gaddafi. He was the young man who got a hold of the golden gun, and he was waving this revolver, I imagine it's gold-plated, in the air. And the thing that was so interesting about him, about the globalized world we live in, he was wearing a New York Yankees cap. So we live in a globalized world in this way, and this particular rebellion, this intervention, is playing out right in front of us in real time. So as Paul just mentioned, I want to continue the story. In last week's lecture, as Paul mentioned, I noted that there are very powerful arguments against intervention that we can find in John Stuart Mill's classic text on non-intervention from 1859. And we've made a few copies over there that you could pick up on the way out if you would like. And I argued that one can extract from the Millian project three sets of principles. One of them was the principle of national security. The other was the principle of humanitarian protection. And the third was the principle of collective self-determination. And all of these principles work in the Millian argument. And as I mentioned last week, all of them, and especially the collective self-determination principle, works in favor of non-intervention. The way that one can respect the identity of a people is to allow them to work out the own terms of their life amongst themselves without outside interference. And on top of that, intervening is usually dangerous, so the national security principle comes into play. And thirdly, according to Mill, in one of his more original arguments, it usually does much more harm than good. It simply creates another civil war, another autocracy, or an empire, rather than a new free government. So that was his warning. But that's not the whole essay. If you read the essay before, or if you read it over the next week, you'll see that in this essay, wonderfully entitled A Few Words on Non-Intervention, most of the words are on intervention in this essay. And he's talking about the circumstances under which one should intervene. And he has two sets of reasons. One set of reasons override non-intervention. That is, that there are ethical concerns that, even though the reasons for non-intervention are there, are simply overpowering, overwhelming, paramount, he calls them. And that's one set of arguments for intervention. And those sets of concerns, as I'll mention today, are largely ones of national security and of humanitarian protection, which will override our otherwise default principle of non-intervention. But there are also some concerns that urge us to disregard the arguments for non-intervention because the key assumptions that sustain non-intervention, the duty especially to respect self-determination, don't hold in a particular circumstance. The circumstances of a nation meriting the respect of non-intervention don't hold. That I'm going to talk about next week when I talk about secession and imperialism and what's wrong with them, what's wrong with imperialism. And this week I want to talk about the overriding concerns, the national security concerns and the humanitarian concerns that should lead us to override non-intervention. I have four, it's way too many, but four national security concerns in our literature as it's evolved, some from Mill, some beyond Mill, that suggest why one should override non-intervention. I'm going to go over them very briefly. Some have to do with rescuing citizens, ideological warfare, post-just war reform of an aggressor, and lastly, the global balance of power. And I've got two humanitarian concerns to override. One has to do with ending a protracted civil war, and the other has to do with classic humanitarian intervention. And for that, I'm going to talk about Libya. That's the situation of today. And Mill describes them in overriding terms. These are considerations paramount, that's his phrase from the essay, that override. Now, like many liberals, Mill dismisses without much attention some arguments in favor of intervention to promote territory or revenue, he says, in order to enhance national power or prestige or profits. And however prevalent those motives are in real-world history, we know territory and revenue are extraordinarily prevalent, Mill doesn't really pursue them because he regards them as lacking in moral significance. And that is, they shouldn't be the driving motives, or they're not motives we can justify for intervention. And he's interested in cases of just intervention, that is, one that is ethically justifiable, not the historical record of imperialist interventions, in his view. Let me briefly mention the national security ones. He says in the essay, we must accept, of course, any case in which such assistance, that is the intervention, is a measure of legitimate self-defense. Legitimate self-defense is a justification for intervening in another country. And in our literature, we have a number of such cases put in front of us. One of them, of course, is citizen rescue. And these are ones I'm not going to talk about, but that'll be in what I hope will someday, if I write quickly, be a book that'll contain many of these. And citizen rescue is one. And I'll be talking about the Don Pacifico affair in 1850, the U.S. equivalent, the intervention in Gracetown, Nicaragua in 1854, two early cases. And then I'm going to spend most of that section on Entebbe, talking about why I find, despite the many abuses that have been associated with interventions to rescue your citizens, the Entebbe one comes closest to a justifiable one, and that's because it was so surgical and it was generally a last resort. Many others, of course, are not. But I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'd be happy to address any questions you might have. I'm also going to reject arguments to intervene for the sake of shifting the global balance of power. And a number of my colleagues in the field, and including a very good moral philosopher, Richard Miller, have made some arguments that put on the table the idea that shifting the global balance of power would be an ethically justifiable intervention. And I think there are many problems of that. Any given shift in any country that would actually tip the balance of power in ways that were important for your security is likely to be too big a country that you can safely intervene in. That's going to be the essence of that argument, but there's some others too. The third that I'm also not going to talk about is the dilemmas associated with intervening in the course of a just defensive war after you've got to the border, and whether you need to stop at the border and can keep going. Mill, of course, was worried about Napoleon. They got rid of him, but they sent him too close to Elba. He came back. After Waterloo, St. Helena. He also talks in very informative ways about what should happen in the U.S. South. He's a strong advocate of radical reconstruction because he thought otherwise the South would rebel again, or all of the blood that expended in the freeing of African Americans would be wasted. So he's a very strong radical reconstructionist. Our modern analogies of this, of course, in our modern time are post-war Germany and post-war Japan. And all I want to do in this section is identify how difficult the intervention, in quotes, that is the occupation of Japan, was from a moral point of view. It's not the case, as I read the new literature, that one could simply have promised them to keep the emperor and it would have been an easy surrender. That's not what have happened. In any circumstance, it has been costly. And I want to identify those moral dilemmas. But what I do want to talk about today with regard to security is one other, a very interesting argument about internationalized civil war. I'm so pleased to see John Gaddis in the back of the room, so I'm going to step on some of his very well-trod terrain. And Mill, in this few words essay, said that if you're in an internationalized civil war, a system-wide war, that is where, for example, one ideological faction is waging war against another ideological faction across borders, under those circumstances, if the other ideological faction, not your own, is already intervening, then you are justified in intervening too, in response to it. And when he brings out examples of this, he talks about the following. If, and here I quote, if this country, Great Britain, on account of its freedom, should find itself menaced with attack by a coalition of continental despots, it ought to consider the Popular Party in every nation of the continent as its natural ally. The liberals should be to it, he says, what the Protestants of Europe were to the government of Queen Elizabeth. So, Protestants versus Catholics, liberals versus autocrats. He has in mind the 1830s and 40s of his own time, but Protestants versus Catholics. In that kind of a situation where global politics is fought by ideological factions across borders, a transnational civil war, under those circumstances, if the other side is intervening to prop up its guys, you can justifiably intervene to prop up yours. That's his argument. It has some logical claim to it, but what I'm trying to do is look into it in a little bit more deeply. I'm not going to talk about the 1830s and 40s because it is much more complicated than he portrays there. What I want to go back is to the argument that would have appealed to so many of his readers from this essay, and that is the kind of logic that existed in some religious civil wars. Go back to the 16th century that he's referring to. And we can find examples of this. I found an interesting quote from Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, who was Elizabeth I's ambassador in France in the 1560s. And he advocated intervention in support of fellow Protestants by warning, and I quote, "Now when the general design is to exterminate all nations dissenting with them in religion, what will become of us when the like professors with us shall be destroyed in Flanders and France?" In the 16th century, professors weren't folks like us. Professors were somebody who professed the same thing. They were co-believers. So he's worried, if the Catholics are doing in the Protestants, what's going to become of us? Not so much by attacking England, but by doing in the Protestants of Europe. That was Sir Nicholas's concern. It, of course, also resonates, as I implied, in the logic of the 20th century. In the 20th century Cold War, in the rhetoric of the Reagan Doctrine, for example, which pledged, again I quote, "We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to defy Soviet aggression and secure rights which have been ours since birth. Support for freedom fighters is self-defense." That's the essence of the Reagan Doctrine. Basically, he's adding a rollback, in many respects, version to the traditional containment of American post-war foreign policy. In practice, the early Cold War did witness a whole series of covert actions by the US in Albania and China, and Soviet efforts to control local communist parties in Europe and elsewhere. Reagan and Brezhnev, we know, practiced their doctrines in Nicaragua and Czechoslovakia, respectively, each of them engaging in interventions. But at the same time, seeing that as an ethical model of the Cold War, many of us have come to see as much too crude and dangerous, because the exceptions were at least as important to the success of the Cold War on both sides. The West's support for Tito's Yugoslavia was very, very important. And the East, that is the Soviet support for Third World nationalists, was very important in the global balance of power. And not to speak of the best of the examples, the effective combination of East-West détente with triangulation devised by the Nixon administration to help exploit the Chinese split from the Soviets in the 1970s. So there's a lot of reasons not to buy into the modern Cold War logic. But what I like to suggest is there are also not reasons to buy into Mill's argument, invoking that iconic figure of British history, Elizabeth the Great. And here I'm referring to a very interesting event called the Expedition to New Haven. Now, not this New Haven, it was a different New Haven. The New Haven that's being referred to is Le Havre in Normandy in France. And what happened is that during the polarizing civil wars, Elizabeth learned from this New Haven expedition, which was a failure, to have a very different foreign policy that followed it. Now in 1559, she intervened to roll back the Catholic threat, I'm using Cold War language, in Scotland. She sent troops to assist the more powerful faction of the Scottish Protestant lords who were struggling against a regime sustained by French forces. When her more radical advisors, Throckmorton and others, urged her to do the same in France, across the Channel, she reluctantly agreed to send an expedition to France to intervene in France to support the Protestant nobles who were rebelling against their Catholic king. The expeditionary force landed in New Haven, Le Havre, marched in to meet their putative French allies. They got on each other's nerves very quickly. Quarrels broke out. The French Protestants very quickly, within just a couple months, defected from the English Protestant expedition. They got a better deal promised to them by their French Catholic monarch, and they just couldn't stand the idea of Englishmen on French soil. So the entire expedition collapsed. There were relatively high casualties, completely wasted, a large loss of treasure. She then developed a much more sophisticated foreign policy, whose basic principles were the following two. Number one, she would only intervene where she would be convinced was a vital necessity. And for her, that meant Scotland and Flanders. It was seen as very important to prevent the Catholic powers from fully controlling Flanders. Flanders was the industrial heartland of 16th century Europe. Having that controlled by one hostile power would be, to her, unacceptable. But even then, she would only intervene in a secondary capacity if she had strong local allies. And this was the doctrine that she developed. She further added to that a diplomacy that played Catholic France off against Catholic Spain to prevent them from uniting against her. A diplomacy that was followed a century later by Cardinal Richelieu among the Catholic powers, who wisely aligned with Protestant states as a way to preserve the French national monarchy. And so consistent with this, the logic of an international civil war doesn't really stand up even to the examples that Mill puts in front of it. It's when you move from the abstract logic of counter-intervention to the reality of the histories, even the history that he himself was invoking, it doesn't really sustain itself. For us, I think the lesson there is one of caution, that however logical that may sound, the practical realities of international history, international politics, suggest that we should not adopt that, other than in the extreme circumstances, perhaps the kind of ones that she was talking about. So let me then pass over again the Reconstruction issue. And having talked a bit about national security and being more than willing to come back to any of those examples in questions or answer, or to recommend it to you in the eventual written version of all this, let me turn to what is the issues of another circumstance for overriding, and that's humanitarian protection. That is, intervening to save lives. That is, to reduce harms to individuals. And there are two cases that Mill brings forward to us for humanitarian protection. And one of them, the first of them, is what he calls a protracted civil war. That is, when a civil war goes on for a long time. Remember, he's in favor of the sides fighting out in civil wars. That's the way you self-determine. You fight to a conclusion. That's his position. But if that civil war goes on for time after time, year after year, armies clashing and grinding the faces of the poor, the farmers, the workers in the cities. If that's the course of it, then he says it becomes one that needs to be overridden. He says in this case, a protracted civil war in which the contending parties are so equally balanced that there is no probability of a speedy issue. Or if there is, the victorious side cannot hope to keep down the vanquished, but by severities repugnant to humanity and injurious to the permanent welfare of the country. So some civil wars, the ones that just grind on and on without any prospect of a ready victory, are ones that need to be stopped because of the harm that they inflict upon ordinary human beings, non-combatants and others. And he talks about a variety of circumstances in which one should intervene. One for the case of ethnic civil wars. He brings to mind the Greeks and the Turks, and also the case of the Belgians and the Dutch. Those I want to postpone to next week when we talk about secession, because for them the solution is intervention with partition. The one I want to focus on this week is the civil wars that are fought over political motives, political ends, who's going to rule, call them ideological civil wars, the left, the right, or just whoever gets control of state power. And there he talks about a couple of them, but the one that he's most interested in is one that takes place in Portugal. And there he notices there are two factions that are struggling, to control. One of them of the Republican left and the other monarchical. And he notes that at one point there occurred an equitable compromise, and it seemed to have produced good results in Portugal. And that's all that he says about it in this one. Now, we can look into Portugal at this point and see a whole series of civil wars. And then we see with the rules of King Pedro from 1853 to 1861 and King Luis from 1861 to 1869, suddenly the country calms down. A national government is formed, and it begins to re-enter into the modern world with improvements for the population. Before then, it's civil war. So I kept wondering, what exact intervention did he have in mind? It's hard to be sure, and I could certainly be proven wrong, but I spent a couple summers ago a number of very pleasant days at the University of Southampton reading Palmerston's private papers from the 1840s, all of which are nicely kept there. And after having finished that, my guess is that the intervention that he has in mind took place in 1846. Then, as I'd mentioned, Portuguese politics were radically split and there was significant violence. They had been so for more than a generation. There were two groups, one group calling themselves the Chartist. This was a moderate, quasi-constitutional, definitely pro-monarchical group that happened to be in power. And the other group were called the Septembrists, and this was a radical in favor of another constitution, an earlier, more radical constitution of 1822. Beginning in the 1830s, Britain had supported the more conservative group, aligned behind someone named Queen Maria, and her ministers were basically monarchist within the shape of a conservative constitution. At this point, the Septembrists, the more radical Republican-styled group, took up arms, and they then began to fight a rather protracted civil war that attracted the interest of Spain, France, and England. France and Spain were pressing perhaps for intervention for the sake of who knows what. At this point, Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, sent a Colonel Wilde, who was a special envoy and a secret envoy, to exercise what Palmerston, in one of his letters to him, called a perspective of force. That was the phrase that he said that was the mandate addressed to Colonel Wilde. And what this involved after Wilde arrived in Portugal was pressuring both factions, the monarchist under Queen Maria, the Republicans, the Septembrists, and he pressured them to form a coalition, that is, a mediated, joint, unified government. And he did so by mobilizing some Spanish troops on land. He called in a British squadron to blast away at the shore for a while, sending a message that they could improve their aim if there wasn't better cooperation. And when he then basically isolated the Septembrists around Oporto, he put extreme pressure on them. This is Wilde, persuading them to join the government of Queen Maria and lay down the rest of their claims, persuading Queen Maria to take away the charges she had placed against the Septembrists and to modify the Constitution in a more Republican direction, a classic mediated compromise solution. And Mill commented, "It looked ill at the commencement, Again, not referring to the particular action, but what I think is this 1846 intervention. But I continue the quote, "It could be justified by the event, a really healing measure," he called it. This was his endorsement of this intervention. It sounded like a nice story. When we look a little further, however, there are some problems. Genuine stability took a few more years, perhaps not surprisingly, given the difficulties of mediation. And its decisive impetus was, rather than the weak compromise of 1846, it was more the reforms, as I mentioned earlier, that were launched by the wise and very industrious King Pedro, who replaced his mother in 1853. He had a very short reign. He died of cholera in 1861. But he began to launch the real reforms that made the country reconcilable. That is, he was the one who helped to create a genuine political center amongst the various elite factions and begun administrative reforms that allowed Portugal to come back on its feet, launched an economic development program the first modern roads and railroads were built in Portugal, and Portugal then began its integration into the modern European world. That was part of the good story. The more difficult part of the story is that having intervened in 1846, England basically stayed over the horizon, regularly meddling in Portuguese politics and in the Portuguese Empire in ways that were, in the end, quite resented by the Portuguese government, despite their strong dependence upon Britain. So hardly a happy self-determination story, but arguably, as Mill was right in 1859, for him, a justifiable intervention. I'll draw some lessons from this in a moment, but one thing that made me very curious as I read through the documents was, why was this a secret special envoy sent? Number one, it wasn't secret to the Portuguese. He showed up at all the factions. He pressured the Queen. He pressured the Septembrists. It wasn't secret to the British admiral offshore. He was taking instructions from Wilde. It wasn't secret to the British ambassador who was there, who was also taking instructions. It wasn't secret to the Spanish. They were cooperating, taking Wilde's suggestions. The French quickly knew about it. The cabinet, I found out, knew about it. Well, so why secret? And it turns out, quite interestingly in the documents, the one person it was kept secret from was Queen Victoria, because she was pursuing a separate diplomacy, trying to prop up Queen Maria. There was sort of monarchical solidarity. And she was not submitting her diplomatic letters to the cabinet. And Palmerston complained repeatedly about the fact that this was not quite a responsible government that was supposed to be if the Queen was running her own foreign policy. So that was the one curiosity I found in the archives. But what are the lessons? The two lessons I think that are relevant from the ethical point of view, the political and ethical point of view, is armed intervention may be justifiable in these kind of circumstances to halt a war, a protracted civil war, but it's unlikely to be sufficient. Additional measures will be needed to make the intervention stick, to make it sustainable, to make it effective. Ideally, those measures will be domestic, because it will have created circumstances of genuine self-rule. But if not, some kind of a further international presence may be needed. And otherwise, if it's a quick surgical intervention, it may soon have to be repeated if it doesn't acquire the kind of roots that we in our modern literature describe as peace building. The second suggestion that comes from this is that unilateral interventions, even well-meaning, as potentially this one was in 1846, very soon deteriorate, become corrupted by self-dealing kind of motives, and the British presence there was certainly exploitative over time, making a case for multilateralism. So that's the first of the humanitarian interventions, stopping a protracted civil war. Let me now turn to the one that we're thinking about most today, the classic humanitarian intervention. That is the kind of intervention that is designed to stop, the phrases run, a massacre, a genocide, maybe institutionalized slavery. Michael Walzer, another writer in this field, calls them drawing upon the classic phrases, though not Mill's own, massacres that shocked the conscience of mankind. So here the case is different from a protracted civil war. In a protracted civil war, there are non-combatant casualties, which are horrendous, as Mill mentioned. There is no government that's really in charge. There are armies, ravaging the countryside. Here, the government is much too much in charge and has launched a campaign of slaughter against its own population, as we see, for example, in a genocide. Now, in the literature on humanitarian intervention, arguments have been made that the intervener should have a morally defensible motive, helping those who are being slaughtered, share the purpose of ending the slaughter, and have an aim to eventually help establish a self-determining people. It can't just be an excuse for imperialism. Furthermore, there is the standard just war arguments for last resort after exploring peaceful resolution. And it should be a case that if it's going to be an ethically justifiable intervention, it should only take place in circumstances under which it's likely to save more lives than it costs. You don't intervene to save people and start World War III, to take the classic example of that. We know we have these concerns because we know that humanitarian interventions have been repeatedly exploited. One can go down the list of armed interventions in countries that then turn out into ordinary old imperialism. From our 1898 intervention in Cuba, for example, to the many, many others that we could list. But we can also find examples of the kind of slaughters that could have motivated an intervention, given their horrendous quality, and some did and some did not. Most of the big examples are after Mill's time. Mill actually couldn't quite imagine, this is not a category he talks about, couldn't quite imagine what he calls a civilized government engaging in these kinds of slaughters. He thought that that was limited to other parts of the world that we'll talk about next week. Civilized governments, he couldn't quite imagine the 20th century history of civilized governments. And so the models that would have justified interventions in our time are things like the Holocaust. In 1971 in Bangladesh, for example, where the government of Pakistan turned against the people of East Pakistan, killed between 200 and 300,000 and generated about 6 million refugees. And there, of course, India did intervene. Cambodia, where even though it's not a genocide, technically 1.8, 1.9 million people were killed in circumstances from either direct slaughter to the creating of circumstances under which they were likely to starve to death. Rwanda, in our own time, where there was no real intervention other than by the RPF, one of the factions who came in to try to stop it, and then much too belatedly and with mixed purposes, the French. Sudan in 2003, not later, but Sudan in 2003, there was a kind of a slaughter that would have arguably justified an intervention. And now we have in front of us today the question of Libya, beginning this past spring. So in Libya, 2011, we have some questions to face. Is it legal as a humanitarian intervention? Is it ethical as a humanitarian intervention? One thing we think we know, is that the casualties actually experienced, were nowhere near the level of past humanitarian interventions. I already mentioned Bangladesh, 1971, 200 to 300,000 people killed. These 8 million refugees. Rwanda, 800,000. I've mentioned the other numbers. This motivated, one of the great philosophers who looks at these questions, Michael Walzer, in a recent piece, to say that Libya does not qualify as a humanitarian intervention. It's not a massacre, he said, like Rwanda. And instead, it's an ordinary old civil war, a rebellion against a tyrant, and unfortunately for the Libyans, one that was incapable of succeeding on its own. It should have been left to fight itself out, basically. Classic Millian response. I agree with his comparison to Rwanda. It was certainly not Rwanda. It wasn't the kind of slaughter that historically have justified unilateral interventions as a matter of duty, such as would be generated, for example, by a genocide. It's not that at all. But what I think Michael misses, and where I think I disagree with him, I haven't spoken to him since he published the piece, is that something new has taken place. And it's something called the responsibility to protect, a new doctrine which has significantly modified the standards of humanitarian intervention. I hope you all have a copy of it. It's the paragraphs 138 and 139 of a UN 2005 outcome document. And I suggest that there is a new norm for intervention, and that norm authorized, when it's authorized by the Security Council, can authorize protection, and it replaces the classic massacre standard with something different. Now, we know that we have an authorization from the United Nations Security Council in its classic language in Resolution 1973 of March 17th of this past spring. It authorized UN member states, quote unquote, to take all necessary measures, which means to use force. I'm new here. I'm sorry, I don't. That's okay. I'll resume. He says in this resolution, another intervention, yes. This resolution authorizes member states to take all necessary measures, which in UN language means use force, to protect civilians in civilian populated areas in Libya by establishing a no-fly zone, enforcing an arms embargo against Colonel Gaddafi. The resolution gave teeth to this much heralded proposition called the responsibility to protect that you have in front of you, the 2005 UN World Summit outcome document. And it says that there's a responsibility of the international community if a local home government fails to do so, to provide protection to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Those are the four elements of the responsibility to protect. This is only the third time that this principle has been invoked since its 2005 instantiation in that General Assembly resolution. It was invoked in 2006 to beef up the UN peacekeeping operation in Darfur, set up after the worst of the massacres in Darfur were over, and it nonetheless still failed to provide real protection. But this doctrine was cited in UN Security Council Resolution 1706. The second case that it was used for Chapter 7 enforcement purposes was just a couple weeks before 1973, another resolution that set up sanctions, financial sanctions against Gaddafi's regime. It was when these were not working that a couple weeks later that the Security Council Resolution 1973, as just mentioned, authorized the use of force against the government of against the government of Colonel Gaddafi for the sake of protecting civilians in Libya. It's very important because this new doctrine was designed to bridge the gaps between legality and legitimacy and provide a framework that would be internationally sanctioned for the protection of civilians in circumstances in which their own governments were not doing so. So let me make a couple comments about legality, legitimacy, and then conclude with some comments on outcomes and lessons from the Libyan experience. If we look at that outcome document that's right in front of you, let's first look at legality. That articulated R2P, responsibility to protect. It's a General Assembly resolution. It's a unanimous General Assembly resolution. Every member state of the UN, in 1992 that would have been 192, I guess, have signed on to that document. They've all basically ascribed to it. It's a unanimous declaration. But it's a General Assembly resolution. A General Assembly resolution is only a recommendation. It is not quasi-legislative or legislative in international law. It is only an expression of opinion of what should be done, not what states have pledged by law that they will do. And it's for that reason that Nicaraguan Foreign Minister Miguel Descoto Brockman described the resolution as not having legal force, cannot be considered as a binding source of international law under the terms of international law in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court that describes what is international law. A General Assembly resolution is not. And so he, representing Nicaragua, pushed back against the idea of this new norm of R2P. But it's not quite as straightforward as former Father Descoto Brockman. He's a Jesuit priest who was defrocked by the Pope at one point or another and then went on to a distinguished career in diplomacy. There is afterlife in this world. It's not quite as straightforward for a couple reasons. One is that one element of R2P, genocide, is well established international law. The Genocide Convention is, if anything, the single strongest legal norm in the international panoply with regard to protection and the use of force. The convention requires all states to prevent and punish genocide. It leaves the interpretation to the International Court of Justice in Article 9 and enforcement to the Security Council in Article 8. But it's clearly a well-established norm stopping genocide in international law. The other part that's a little different from what Mr. Miguel Descoto Brockman said is that the Security Council has claimed very wide discretion for its mandate. Under Chapter 7, it has the authority to make binding resolutions that bind on all states in matters of international peace and security. It's a legal body, therefore, whose resolutions have legal binding character to it. And moreover, it's a political body. It's a political body whose discretion is unbound in Article 39 to decide based on its own judgment what constitutes threats to peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. So the Security Council has great international authority according to the UN Charter. And if we look at its record is one of the very wide use of that authority. If we look at its record under Chapter 7, writing enforcement resolutions, there are resolutions that employed sanctions on Rhodesia and South Africa connected with both massive violence and apartheid, military buildup, patterns of aggression. They include enforcement resolutions with regard to genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. Interference with the delivery of humanitarian supplies also was written under Chapter 7. Violations of ceasefires in civil wars, and even coups against democratic governments, as in Haiti, inspired Chapter 7 authoritative binding resolutions to enforce outcomes on states, therefore reading a very, very broad mandate to itself. Thus, the legality of R2P is contestable. It's clearly, what you have in front of you is not the equivalent of a treaty, not at all. On the other hand, the Security Council has operated in a very broad scope, and so by then endorsing R2P, as it did in a later Security Council resolution, it's announcing that its own discretion will include taking into account these concerns. That's not law either, but it does say that a body that has the authority to impose binding obligations is going to use these as part of its criteria. If it sounds murky, it is, but it's a high-powered norm, not yet clear, absolutely clear law, but one that in the past has been deferred to when the Security Council has exercised it. Let's move to legitimacy. Legitimacy of the R2P doctrine. Here I mean how it's received by the community of states. The Kosovo Crisis was a watershed event in the reformulation of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention. And indeed, the NATO states intervened in a famous commission report that I'll describe in a moment. It was declared to be illegal because the Security Council did not authorize the intervention, but legitimate in the phrases of Judge Goldstone. But soon after the Kosovo intervention, the developing states, the G77, despite the 77, this is the UN, there are 132 of them, but they're not called the G132. They condemned in a unanimous declaration the so-called right of humanitarian intervention in paragraph 69 of their ministerial declaration of 24 September 1999, 3 months after the NATO intervention into Kosovo. So the developing countries made clear they're not buying anything with regard to humanitarian intervention. a commission was set up then under Judge Goldstone to try to come to a more objective look at what happened in Kosovo, to try to come to a judgment of it. And Goldstone recruited a whole group of academics, former politicians and diplomats, and they developed a report from all over the world. And they developed a report that identified threshold principles for when an intervention would be justified. The first of these are severe violations of international human rights or humanitarian law, subjection of a civilian society, I'm quoting, to great suffering and risk due to the failure of the state that entails a breakdown of governments at the level of the territorial sovereign state. So a lot of violations of humanitarian law, a lot of suffering, whether inflicted by a state or just because the state is broken down. Now, needless to say, this is pretty fuzzy and it's very wide if that's the threshold principle for intervention. When they considered who could authorize it, they said, okay, the Security Council would be the best, but if these are the circumstances, somebody should do something. So we got a very wide license that the Kosovo Commission is endorsing. Not noticeably as wide as Security Council practice in the 1990s, when they were intervening for anything and everything that they could put together a majority for. But nonetheless, this is very wide standards, human rights, human suffering, etc. This produced a great deal of debate, needless to say. Kofi Annan, realizing that the Kosovo Commission was not going to resolve this issue, think of what the G77 had already said just a few months before, commissioned two friends of his, Mohammed Saknoun and Gareth Evans, the former foreign ministers of Algeria and Australia, respectively, to chair a commission that was funded by the government of Canada, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. They're covering their bases, intervention and state sovereignty, ICISS, to investigate the circumstances of when an intervention would be legitimate. What they did in a very interesting report is they narrowed the triggers for a justifiable intervention in this legitimate term to just large-scale loss of life and large-scale ethnic cleansing. So they're, this is narrowing compared to human rights and suffering, when either by the action or inaction of states. When it comes to authority, they fulsomely say that the right authority is the Security Council, but they go on to say, in shocking, I'm quoting, in shocking situations, concerned states may not rule out other measures, which means not always Security Council. Well, Annan welcomed that report in May of 2001. I was working for him at that point. He said to me, Michael, let's arrange a big meeting to brief this report in the UN. So I go off to the President of the General Assembly and I'd say I'd like to have the ECOSOC room, little used, a great big nice room, to present the report and let's have it debated and discussed among the membership. The President of the GA turned back to me and says, no way. This is not UN doctrine, and we are not going to stir up the equivalent of a diplomatic riot by presenting this in an official capacity. So I had to go across the street, and with Canadian money, we booked the Millennium Plaza Ballroom, and Saknoun and Evans presented the report there to quite a heated debate. So it could not even be discussed within a UN building in May of 2001. It's a sign of the really hard work and the diplomatic skill of Evans and Saknoun that just 4 and a bit years later, you have those 2 paragraphs in front of you. These are unanimous statements from the entire membership of the UN in endorsing R2P. But notice how it's different, and it's very important. That's the reason I Xeroxed that copy to you. Number 1, they further narrowed the triggers very carefully. They went from human rights, Kosovo Commission, to large-scale human casualties, the ICISS, to 4 elements of R2P: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Notice this is a much narrower set of triggers than what we described before, and all of these have international legal significance. Ethnic cleansing after the ICTY trials, crimes against humanity is well established within international criminal law, genocide and war crimes are too. And notice, in case anybody was hard of hearing in the international community. I think I underlined it. I don't know if the underlines show up. Look how many times they thought it was necessary to repeat exactly those 4 elements in the paragraphs, as if any hard of hearing folks thought that there would be other circumstances that would justify an intervention. I think it's 5 times in those paragraphs. It is rhetorically ridiculous, but politically significant that they thought they had to say those 4 phrases, those 4 phrases 5 times in a single paragraph. The other significant transformation that you'll see is that there is no ambiguity whatsoever, only when endorsed by the Security Council. And under those terms, the membership could sign on to those 2 paragraphs, 138 and 139. Let me briefly then talk about practice, because here we had the doctrine in 2005. How it would be applied was just as significant. And the most important thing that took place, the first test case of it, other than using it to bless the Sudan operation, but totally ineffectively, no one thought it would have any consequence. But the first real test case of this doctrine was Burma, that is Myanmar, Cyclone Nargis in Burma in 2008. After this cyclone hurricane struck, the Burmese government was totally ineffective in providing aid to a large hunk of their population, particularly the population on the coast. People lacked clean water, medical supplies, running out of food, very severe suffering was taking place. Bernard Kouchner, the inimitable foreign minister and activist of France, and Gareth Evans both went before the press saying, this is an R2P situation. The international community has a responsibility to act to rescue the Burmese population from this impending catastrophe, the lack of clean water, the lack of medicine, the increasing shortage of food. But what happened here was that there was immediate pushback from the Secretary General and from some key other members on the Security Council and from Gareth Evans. Once he was approached, he pulled back from his statement and says, no, it's more complicated than that. And from the standpoint of the UN membership, I haven't asked the Burmese what they thought of it. It was exactly the right thing to do to enhance the legitimacy of R2P. Because even though it was absolutely true that the government was totally ineffective in assisting its own citizens and people were suffering, those were the standards of the ICISS and of the Kosovo report, not the standards of R2P. The standards of R2P, repeated 5 times, were genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And crimes against humanity being the closest to that, but the elements of the crime of crimes against humanity do talk about questions like murder, extermination, enslavement, and widespread or systematic attacks on the civilian population, but they have to be part of a government policy, a consistent plan. And no one could provide evidence that the SLORC, the government of Burma, was planning for their citizens to starve, die of disease, lack medical care. And it's with that pushback that nothing was done. Good diplomacy from Singapore and others eventually opened up the country to assistance, but a few weeks late. But by doing that, by not acting, the legitimacy of this norm was suddenly reinforced very strongly for the G77 developing countries. They had fought hard to have it narrow. The narrowness looked to them as if it would work. And again, in 2 later cases, Kenya in 2008, Guinea in 2009, in both cases there was discussion by some states that it was an R2P situation, but in neither case did the UN or the Security Council invoke it. When my former boss Kofi Annan went to mediate the crisis in Kenya, he was very careful not to use the words in public. This was not an R2P situation. But he knew very well that the government of Kenya was hearing about R2P from other African states, other states, and they knew that they were bargaining under the shadow of R2P. That is, if they did nothing or began to engage in crimes against humanity, some of which were occurring, under those circumstances they might face international sanctions. But it wasn't explicitly used, but it did make the bargaining much more effective. And the same thing happened, I won't go into it, in Guinea in 2009. That brings us to Libya. This is now the most important test case, and here's where I'll wrap up. The resolution authorized to take all necessary measures, classic language authorizing the use of force to protect civilians in civilian populated areas. Here we marry legality, we have a UN Security Council resolution authorizing force, and legitimacy, drawing upon now the principles of R2P. It's at this rating, of course, much too early to get a sense of the long-term implications of all of this. But what we nonetheless have is some claims in front of us. If we look on the justification side, we had President Obama's March 28th speech and a variety of others, and he made the case for the intervention in this speech. And he stressed three things in increasing order of prominence and importance. One was a threat to regional stability. It could upset the ongoing revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. Notice he's also here talking about the international dimensions of the Libyan crisis, which puts it back in the framework of international threats to peace and security, which is the Chapter 7 language. But clearly these were throwaway lines for him. What's more important, of course, was what he called Gaddafi's extreme violence, and he went on to document it, launching jets and helicopters against civilians, the cutoff of water for tens of thousands, including the town of Misrata, cities and towns shelled, gunships unleashed, homes raided, hospitals raided, arbitrary arrest, torture, and the specific ordering of rapes, all of which there was evidence for and led to the indictment before the ICC that was launched at this same time. But that was not the real driver. You probably remember what the real driver was for the president when he was trying to make the case for intervention. And it was the threat of worse to come. It was like Kosovo. It was the threat, not what had happened, but was in his view, likely to happen, was his argument. And it was the looming threat to Benghazi, where the president said we could not wait one more day. A town of 700,000 people, he said. He helpfully then said the size of Charlotte. And for most non-North Carolinians, that didn't help much, but the 700,000 told us something. And he said, Gaddafi had said there'll be no mercy, in quotation marks, and they would be hunted down like rats. That was the claim. And the president said at that point one could not wait. There was no time to wait. Action was necessary. And following, of course, behind the British and the French, he went to the Security Council, following behind the British and the French, and was able to persuade the council to vote on this with 10 votes in favor, no vetoes, but abstentions from Russia, China, India, and Brazil. So nonetheless, it passed as a legal resolution. The problem is that now we know, having had some time, the Red Cross has done surveys, the Red Cross so far has only found 3,500 bodies. That's not 700,000. Hundreds in towns that were subject to attack, not the thousands that people in March were thinking about. Now, the government, the NTC, claims that there are 30 to 50,000 people that have died, but they haven't been found yet. And we don't know whether they will. They might be. They're just in the middle of a civil war, you got better things to do than hunt over potential cemeteries. But still, the key argument that the president made was the threat, not the body count. And we have to ask ourselves, should we have preferred that he waited until we could have a documented 30 to 50,000 before we act? Or was he right, as he claimed he was right, to act to prevent the deaths of 30 to 50,000, which was his claim? It's a hard issue. We won't know. But the question is, should we have waited? And for him, of course, the answer was no. Many would argue that protection is better than regret. But this will be challenged, and we'll see what comes of it. Let me wrap up with two comments. One about the positive of R2P, and then another about the negative, or at least a concern that has arisen. The positive part of R2P, at least for me, is that R2P and the Libya precedent has solved the genocide problem. So what do I mean by that ridiculous statement? By that I do not mean that future genocides have been prevented. You need political will. But what I do mean is that by the new standards of R2P, we've precluded what I would call the genocide trap, the G trap, the G word trap, as the threshold for legitimate protection. Darfurians, for example, in 2003, went through a series of massive slaughters, while an international commission of highly able scholars, the International Commission of Inquiry on Darfur, which is the UN Secretary General, engaged in very extensive, really expert research. They interviewed, they did documentary work, and a year later, they reported back there was no genocide in Darfur. because you could not establish mens rea. That is, you could not establish that Bashir's motive for unleashing the Janjaweed on the people of Darfur was to kill them because they were Darfurians, because they were darker, because they were part of a different religious or other faction. Couldn't prove that. Instead, they did document tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of deaths arbitrarily inflicted on a victimized population in 2003 and 2004. The story after 2005 is much more complicated. It's the Civil War. But before then, this was crimes against humanity and well documented and such in this report. But because they spent a year working over the genocide question, Darfurians died in large numbers. The value of R2P is that we now have a new set of standards that are more, let's call them realistic in the best sense of that word, realistic in tapping into the kind of suffering that people face, that now are operative, that are different from the old humanitarian standards that Michael Walzer invoked when he invoked Rwanda and massacres that shocked the conscience of mankind. We have a new set of standards, and those standards are ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So the new standards are higher, much higher than the Security Council practice of the 90s that terrified the G77, the developing countries, concerned about multilateral imperialism. Much higher than that. And they're also much higher than the standards of the Kosovo Commission, any human rights violations, or the ICSS, satisfying again the concerns of the G77. But they are much lower than just using genocide as the standard. So we have lowered the standards from genocide, lowered the standards that Michael Walzer would see, raised them from the standards that terrified the G77. And we have made this shift in the context of raising the authorization standards. That is, we've made it clear, as they have made it clear, that you need to have a Security Council authorization in order to use these standards that are lower than the genocide standards that have historically justified a unilateral intervention. That is a very interesting normative shift that has taken place and is the result of the Libya episode. Okay. And I think, to my mind at least, this is reasonable. We have a shift of substantive standards that move them down, balanced down from genocide, by an increase in procedural standards that have moved up. And I think that's a relatively sensible balance that has been achieved. So to me, that's the positive part. The negative is that R2P has been severely wounded by Libya, by the Libya episode. To gain approval, I mentioned already, there was a vote for it, but it was not fulsome. It was quite close. There were 10 votes in favor, 5 abstentions, as I mentioned: Brazil, China, Germany, India, and Russia. Brazil, Germany, and India significantly are seeking permanent membership on the Security Council. These will be the new, much more influential members, if indeed they achieve that. South Africa is too, and that even though South Africa voted for the resolution, it opposed regime change soon afterwards. So it changed its mind when it saw regime change taking place. The Arab League supported the intervention, and that was quite important, and it was mentioned in the Security Council resolution. But only the UAE and Qatar provided money, and a trivial Air Force contingent. The African Union did condemn Gaddafi, but it also condemned the airstrikes that followed. So the legitimacy, the support, is not as deep as it looks. It was a thin authorization behind this resolution. The most important thing is that the resolution didn't really authorize the toppling of Colonel Gaddafi. President Obama, his strategy was that they would provide protection, okay, and the toppling would take place as economic sanctions bit on Gaddafi's regime. That is, they would pull the financial plug. What was not taken into account or not known is that Gaddafi was sitting on bales of $100 bills in Tripoli and basements full of gold bars and gold coins. He was not going to run out of money for an awful long time. I'm wondering where the money is right now. But at any rate, he had plenty to run a civil war. So it didn't work. It then led to a series of unpalatable alternatives. If Gaddafi were to stop victimizing civilians and still retain power while the rebels maintained their own territory, would partition be an acceptable solution to the mediators under Mr. Khattab, who had been sent by the Security Council to try to resolve the crisis? That was one question. To me, very unpromising. The other would be if they could not achieve an agreement, a partition or any other agreement of the country, would the international community sit by protecting the Libyan people from large-scale victimization, being bombed by Gaddafi's aircraft, while they fought it out with small arms, both sides, shooting each other with pistols and rifles rather than artillery and aircraft? And that would have been within the framework of the authorized resolution to protect the civilian population of Libya. Or would the interveners simply brush aside the restrictions in UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and wholeheartedly aid the rebels and topple Gaddafi? And of course, we know the answer. That was the third was chosen. That is, there was Qatar provided funds directly to the rebels, possibly arms. The UK and France put trainers on the ground, and there may have also been American special forces there, serving as bombing spotters and air coordinators dropped in onto the ground, again in violation of the arms embargo. And more importantly, the air campaign moved from the targeting of the weapons that were directly harming Libyan citizens to the overthrow of the regime. They went after headquarters, they went after communications, they went after depots, they went after the Libyan army and basically smashed it. That was not what most of the states that voted for the resolution had in mind. They were voting for the protection of civilians. They were voting for an immaculate intervention, one that would take place under these terms, and somehow or other Gaddafi would disappear, or he would simply negotiate a solution. So what we now see of what has happened is that we've had this successful overthrow of Gaddafi's regime, and Gaddafi himself as of today. But many of the states, not all the states, not Britain, France, or the US, who voted for this resolution thought that they were burned, thought that they were tricked. And so when another R2P potential situation arose, Syria, the French, the British, in the background the Americans, tried to get a weak resolution, but nonetheless a Chapter 7 one, that would sanction Mr. Assad's regime and send a message to the rebels that, we know you're suffering and it's illegitimate, and a message to Assad that this is not business as normal, so financial sanctions might be down the road. But this resolution didn't even have financial sanctions in it. It only said it would consider financial sanctions. The Russians and the Chinese negotiated to water down the resolution. When it was presented to the Council, they both vetoed it, a very rare double veto in the Security Council. So what is happening, and this had a good deal of support elsewhere in the UN, is the sense that for some, this resolution, an R2P, which was going to solve the problem of protection without creating the problem of imperialism, didn't quite succeed. The idea of an immaculate intervention turns out, they should have known, to be unrealistic. So when we look to the future, we can hope that a more, let's call it a mature or small r, realistic understanding enters in, is that immaculate interventions under these kind of circumstances will be very difficult to do. And so the Security Council is going to need to come to the understanding that under some circumstances, protection will be regime change. But they also need to have assurances that if that is the case, that it'll be done in a multilateral way. It won't be a rush for oil concessions. It won't be a tip of the balance of power. It will be done in ways that are still genuinely multilateral. Or if they think that's impossible and the imperial element is too dangerous, there'll be a sense that R2P is really not applicable in that kind of a situation. It just won't work, especially not on the forceful end of things. There still may be sanctions. But that more mature level of understanding has not yet been achieved yet. And so at the present time, we can celebrate, if you will, with the Libyan people, their liberation. It would not have succeeded without the bombing by NATO. And at the same time, we can commiserate with the Syrians that the international community can't express itself on their side. So let me stop here and welcome your questions and comments. floor is open. Yes, please. Maybe you should identify yourself if you would.
My name is Tom Donahue. I'm in ethics, politics, and economics. I just have some questions of clarification. It may just be that I'm not paying attention enough, but maybe it'll be helpful. So one is that when you have both your national security overriders, which it seems that the only one you think is a genuine overrider is legitimate self-defense.
I'm sorry, I didn't talk about it, but also rescuing your citizens sometimes.
Okay, so those two are, and the other two, the shifting balance of power and the borders one, I guess, are not. And then for the humanitarian, what I wonder is, you also stipulated after you said, for instance, ending protracted civil war and the ordinary people are being around like dust, at least by a long drawn-out conflict. You then said, but also there are these other conditions. For instance, that we might need additional measures. These would be, I guess, postbellum measures, sticking around and trying to make sure that the government afterwards is a good one, and that it needs to be multilateral. So I guess I'm wondering, are you trying to say that first there's a question of overriding the presumption, and that these two, national security, and then these two humanitarian override that, then we get to something like prima facie justifiability or pro tanto justifiability,
Right.
and then these, at the end, these more consequentialist but also highly contextual considerations where we only finally know that really it is justified all things considered. Is that sort of the framework you're thinking of?
That's exactly the framework that I want to express. That said, that's the framework I want to express, exactly as you've summarized it. But I'm also going to say that the world is complicated enough that it makes a difference exactly how it's done when we come down into the real detail. Some multilateral schemes are totally exploitable and exploited. So the details really do make a difference. But you've summarized the framework that I'm arguing for, just as I would have liked to.
So, and I guess the other question is, so when you say that, I can't decide if you're saying that Waltzer's horror shocking to the conscience of mankind is a wrong formulation of the second overriding consideration, and if we frame it in terms of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, that's a more accurate formulation of this second consideration, or whether it's genuinely a different one that's actually somehow in competition with Waltzer's, and we should just reject the Waltzerian formulation altogether.
I think that
No,
that's not my view. It's being replaced. It's being replaced by R2P, in the sense that the Waltzer's standard is predominantly, though he doesn't phrase it exactly that way, the genocide standard. And the thing that's unique to it is that historically, despite, as I mentioned, Article 8 of the Genocide Treaty, it has been regarded as a sufficient justification, at least in ethical terms, for unilateral action. That is to stop a genocide. And that's been Waltzer's view, and it's one that he then applies to Libya, doesn't qualify. What has happened with the R2P standard is that we've said that things less than genocide, or addition to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, could also justify the violation of sovereignty, but only if it has a Security Council authorization. So we have broadened or lowered the standard from the high genocide standard to this lower one, but we've raised the procedural standard from unilateral to multilateral. And I think that's what's happening with R2P. And as you can tell from the tonation, I think that's a progressive move, if it works. Yes, please.
Just a quick question. I was struck by the end of your talk and talking about the change in Libya. And 2020 hindsight, we know that it was more difficult than maybe was initially envisioned by those making the decision and authorizing things within the UN. So I just wanted to ask you, what if it had happened to be an immaculate intervention, as you put it? How would your lecture have been different today? And is it something that's really about international law, or is it something about maybe the tactical skill of those doing the intervening and their ability to be effective in those situations rather than the sort of normative
Yeah.
I'm just curious. If
Yeah.
the outcome had been different,
Right.
what would you be saying right now?
We would be just, sitting around celebrating, in the sense that if Gaddafi had, there were a lot of defections from his government. President Obama was counting upon the defections, plus the idea that he would never be able to lead a normal life, to produce a surrender and maybe an exile, though there already had been, of course, this awkward ICC indictment that came in between. But there was some hope that this would happen, and indeed, among many of the states who voted for it, definitely a hope that this would be an easy outcome. If that had occurred, I think we'd be celebrating, and we would probably have a very weak sanctions regime against Assad right now. That's purely hypothetical guessing. That would have carried through momentum that would have assuaged a lot of concerns of many G77 members. Russia and China would still have been very nervous about this, but I don't think if there had been a groundswell in the G77 that they would have done a veto, and if Libya had gone the way they had hoped it would, they would have done another abstention, and there could have been a vote that had gone through. That might be a bit idealistic. Russia has very strong interest in the Assad regime, and China has been historically very, very nervous about R2P. Though I should mention that both Russia and China endorsed the principle in abstract at a 2009 review session on R2P. And they warned you got to be very careful in application. So they feel some degree of pressure to join the global consensus for R2P. But as soon as they had Libya in front of them, they felt, and they were worried about another instance of that, they felt very comfortable and no apologies, very strong statements vetoing the Syrian resolution. It may still come back, depending upon what happens. The casualties in Syria already are larger than the casualties in Libya, from the estimates we have. These things are always fuzzy. So it's a serious issue. Paul.
So I'm a little worried that you're proclaiming victory over the Waltzer too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you to reflect on another dimension of what we might call the illegality of
Mm-hmm.
R2P.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have an instance,
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
and it's one that has resulted in all of this skepticism for the
Mhm.
reasons that you described.
Mm.
But the dimension that I would think is equally troubling that you haven't quite addressed directly is the arbitrary and capricious nature of the moments at which it's appealed to.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of examples
Sure.
in the world,
Yeah.
many of them pressing right now.
Yeah.
Talked about the Syrian problem,
Right.
but this sense, if Libya is not followed,
Yeah.
if it's a one-shot deal,
Yep.
um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that this can appear as a legal norm.
Mm-hmm.
It could appear as something to which the Security Council occasionally makes reference in exercising its Chapter 7 power. But the idea that we have a new legal norm here strikes me
Yeah.
as a very distant
Mm-hmm.
from where we are at the moment, which leads me to think that if we want to talk about what's likely to be the action standard under which interventions occur, Waltzer may not be so far off,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe more so now after Libya
Mm-hmm.
than before.
Yeah. No, we might, because this is not a happy outcome for the reasons already suggested. And if it's going to become a norm, I mean, for our lawyer friends, it's not going to become customary international law until you get a lot of practice by a lot of states all agreeing, then, it's law. And it's not, or otherwise you'd need a revision of the UN Charter, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's not going to be a hard law norm for an awful long time. But you're referring, I think, to something looser than that. And that's not going to happen until we have another more set of successes. And this is a very mixed success from the standpoint of many countries. From Britain, France, and the US, they got a legal intervention that served their ethical and also political interest. But for other countries, this was an alarm bell, that they felt that they were snookered. And so we've got to get more cases that will give them a sense that it'll be applied in a way that is in the global interest, rather than just in the interest of the great powers. And that has not yet been done yet. So I am now concerned. If we get at some point, let's say for the poor Syrians, if it continues to get bad as it has been and gets worse, I'm hoping that there would be some at least multilateral recognition of the situation. Syria is the last place anybody would want to send forces into. It's a very different situation, as I understand it, from the Libyan one, which, despite all the problems, was easy. But nonetheless, some degree of sanction would be important for establishing a more legitimate, legal, protective international order. But that we don't know yet, and it would take that and then maybe a few more after that before, in the sense that I think you're referring to, we'd have a new, not new law, but a new norm, as you say, a new legal norm, a legalizing norm. And I think we're still pretty far from it. Yeah, please.
So, I mean, I think especially with this question of Libya, one of the other things that seems to come up, I mean, obviously there's this issue of regime change, and to what extent that plays into R2P. And connected to that strikes me that there's also this issue of how the intervention is done, right? The means, which is mentioned here, appropriate and necessary means. Strikes me that if the goal of this was actually to prevent civilian casualties, to safeguard civilians,
Right.
then this intervention would not have been done with airplanes flying at heights and bombing from heights where they actually admitted that they could not target as well. It strikes me that if you're going to do an intervention, there's a for the sake of humanitarian reasons, you have to. The idea that you're then not going to put your own people into any risk seems to be contrary to that, because the idea of humanitarian intervention, it doesn't matter whose citizen it is. If anything, those are soldiers in $1 million aircraft, and they can take a little risk to fly 5,000 feet lower for the sake of being, I don't know how much more accurate. So it strikes me that that's probably an issue, and I know that that's giving a lot of people pause as well. So to what extent is also that idea of, the fact that clearly most of your talk and a lot of the debate is about how you trigger these things. To what extent is there a debate also about the means, and about really having a serious debate about maybe this, about trying to set some standards for if we're going to save civilian lives, how interventions can be carried out on a military level to ensure that happens?
I see that as less of a problem. Again, I haven't been there. I don't have any special access to any information, but I see that as what you described to me is the problem of Kosovo. That is, it was fought at very high altitude with very severe consequences for innocent Serbs. Hospitals, schools, trains, bridges during rush hour, the Chinese embassy, all of these things were blown up under those kinds of circumstances, leading people to legitimately complain that the NATO forces weren't willing to take sufficient risk to save people who should have been saved. This is a little different situation. The first attacks were on an extremely vulnerable Air Force, and the air suppression was extremely successful. There was a massive US-led attack on day one that dealt with all of his Air Force, all of his air capacity and air defense, radars, all of that was quickly eliminated. So there was very little resistance that they could mount, unlike in Serbia, where anti-aircraft fire, missiles, and others were available, which forced, at least in NATO's estimation, operating at a high level. Now, NATO standard practice is they don't operate very low in any case because there's a potential ground fire. And there were some incidents that we've read about, or was a bomb dropped in the wrong place. But as far as I know, and I'd be happy to be corrected, we're talking about very, very small numbers of casualties inflicted by the NATO forces in Libya. Just a few mistakes, nothing like the Kosovo level. So to me, that's less of a problem here. The other issue that was really important, the big problem with Kosovo, in my view, was that they had an incredible threat. That is, it was made very clear to Milosevic that this was going to be an air campaign. The Serbian tanks and artillery pulled into the forest during the daytime. They came out at night. There was very ineffective air war being fought. And that was very different because of the lack of forest cover and things like that. In Libya, the tanks and artillery was extremely vulnerable to U.S. and other aircraft, so it could be done quite effectively in that regard. And the other thing that was different was in Kosovo, the failure to make a credible ground threat was a crucial part of dragging this out in ways that victimized the Serbian population. But here, that was not on the table. I neglected to give you a copy of Security Council Resolution 1973, but there's a special paragraph that says no ground forces, no occupation. That was violated with covert warriors, but not in any large overt way. And so that was taken off the table for the sake of legitimacy. They didn't want to open the door to another Iraq, would have an occupation of the country by any means. And so that was what I think something was different. But you're right that as a matter of principle, in a humanitarian intervention, there should be an expectation that soldiers, if the purpose and the justification for their action is humanitarian, should be willing to take risks that are maybe, I think, larger than the same risks that they would take in a purely defensive campaign, where they can assume that the other side is genuinely hostile, even though there are real non-combatants there. Soldiers should always take risks for non-combatants. But I think that there's an argument that there's a difference in a humanitarian campaign that would create a higher standard. And so and it applies here too and elsewhere. But I just think, and I could well be wrong, that here they did a much better job on that score than in Kosovo, where it really had all the problems I think that you described. Yes, please, yeah, Erica.
You talked about objections to the responsibility to protect primarily on imperialist grounds concerns from developing countries,
Right.
Russia and China. But I know that on the other side, there's also some concerns, particularly within the United States, that agreeing to and defining a principle on paper would commit the United States or other countries to act in situations when maybe it's not politically feasible or politically desirable. So can you talk a little bit about how those types of concerns are overcome?
Yeah. They're overcome in a couple ways. One is just about all countries have made it clear that they hold discretion to apply this. I don't have my copy in front of me, but somewhere at the bottom of the paragraph, they talk about case-by-case assessment. That's the code language, that this may sound like a responsibility, but it's one that they will undertake discretionary. That is, they'll decide or not to decide, which also leads us back into some of the concerns that Paul was talking about of how this is applied over time. Does it acquire legitimacy? And I know as a matter of experience, when we couldn't get a room, as I mentioned, to present the initial R2P report, we went across the street to Millennium Plaza, and then we set up a retreat at Bocantico, the old Rockefeller resort on the Hudson, for the Security Council. So we brought the Security Council up there with Evans and Saknoon to discuss the earlier version, the ICISS report. And it was quite interesting. And this was an off-the-record conversation amongst them completely. And what was interesting is that every single member thought, this is of the Security Council, thought that they could authorize an R2P action, including the use of force. This included Syria, who was a member of the council at the time. That was very interesting. I was very surprised to hear that. No pushback whatsoever. And the Syrians wouldn't speak until they contacted their capital back home to see if they could say that. And Assad, phoned back yes, or emailed back, whatever he does, I don't know, yes. And so they all said that they thought this would authorize them to use force. That was very interesting. So that was unanimous. Very surprising. Security Council liked to have their power enhanced. This was one more thing to it. But the other thing was whether there was a responsibility to act, and that was also absolutely unanimous, no. That is, they are unanimous that this was a license to act, and unanimous that they had no obligation to do so. So there we get back into the world of politics that we experience regularly. Yes, please.
In the Libyan case, this is just a point of clarification. Let's assume away all political constraints on the language of the resolution to intervene. If they had included language in so many words authorizing regime change, in your judgment, is that sanctioned by R2P as it exists in these paragraphs now?
It could if the judgment of the Security Council was that is what is necessary in order to protect civilians, and they come to that judgment. That would be, I it would be a legal authorization. Then we would stand back and question, is it necessary? You know, my guess is it probably was necessary to overthrow the Gaddafi regime over the long run to protect the people of Libya. That is, a coalition or a stalemate would have not produced protection. Legally, I think that they could have done so because the Security Council has extraordinarily wide powers. You remember in the UN Charter, Article 2.7 says that the UN cannot interfere in the domestic jurisdiction of any state except for measures voted under Chapter 7. So if this is voted under Chapter 7, it would open up regime change in the same way they voted in Haiti to kick out General Cedras. And so they could do so again in this regard. Whether it's wise or not, I think yes in this case, probably not in many others. Yeah, Nicholas.
So I wanted to follow up on Paul's comment.
Mhm.
It strikes me that when you lower the standard for intervention, one thing that you can do is actually you can encourage more conflict to occur where none of them occurred in the first place.
You might.
So that you can provoke a reaction that could trigger intervention.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then there's a moral argument in favor of a non-uniform application of the lower standard, rather than just a consequentialist and pragmatic argument. So, in other words, you want to introduce uncertainty about the conditions in which the measure will be applied,
Right.
not just because Syria might be too hard
Yeah.
and so on, but rather because you don't want people to
To game it, right.
To game it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's a moral foundation for a more ambivalent lower standard
Right.
rather than just
Yeah.
pragmatic.
Yeah, I can see exactly what you're getting at. My view is that I think it's elegant, but not a big worry. And the reason I don't think it's a big worry is the premises that you're talking about. There are moral hazard problems. You know, you will have rebels saying, "Here's what we need to do in order to get the UN come rescue us." But I think that in the real world, any rebel out there who thinks that China and Russia are going to come charging to support them, there's enough uncertainty in that this would be a very unwise position for any rebel to take who otherwise thought that they couldn't win. You know, that they couldn't do it on their own, or that they're forced into a struggle by the necessity to survive. So if they're really in the terrain of gaming this, and they're assuming that they can predict what China or Russia are going to do, you know, or what the U.S., France, or the U.S. are going to do, I think that's more than enough uncertainty that we don't need to add in artificial uncertainty to say to the Council, act arbitrarily in order to make sure that it doesn't get gamed as a moral hazard problem. I think we can count upon our irresponsible diplomats to come to the fore and protect us from the danger. I think the danger that logically that you definitely point out. That would be my guess. I would not recommend any rebel anywhere in the world to say that by provoking, you know, crimes against humanity against their group, they'll get rescued. I would not recommend to anyone of that. Yes, please.
I was puzzled with your answer to the previous question,
Mm-hmm.
in which you said a stalemate in Libya would not be suitable. You probably have to go ahead and change the regime, try to protect long term, right?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me to mean that the norm itself contains the conditions under which a clean slate of successes that we will need for it to become more widely accepted is hard to get, because countries will almost inevitably feel snookered, because once a power intervenes to protect the population, you'll have to overthrow the government.
Right.
Furthermore, the powers that intervene face very thorny domestic political issues by saying we did this, but then we're going to let them stay, etc. So it's
Right. I didn't want to create that. I'm very happy you raised it. I don't want to create a general rule that R2P requires regime change. My comment was specifically in regard to Libya. I can't imagine a stable solution where Gaddafi held Tripoli and the rebels held Benghazi, and we would not have, you know, whether we'd want to recognize them as two separate countries or whether we would just say that it stays that way. It didn't seem to me to be a stable solution. In other circumstances, I would definitely favor a mediation between a government and the rebels. I think in Syria it may be the only hope. But in the particular case of Libya, maybe I don't know enough about Libya, that didn't seem stable to me, because the rebels are already got the mountains between Tripoli and the sea. Misrata had been already won over. Sirte was definitely Gaddafi, but it was surroundable. I didn't see a stable situation that could come out of there. But I'm not a Libya specialist.
But you think in most cases it will be possible to protect civilians without overthrowing them?
Yes, I would hope so. If it's not, this is not going to be viable. There's going to have to be a lot of negotiable solutions. As I would hope, for example, the problem with Syria is that, Christians and Alawites are not on the side of these rebels. And they're significant parts of the population. So, Assad can turn out big demonstrations for himself that look, and they're based upon people that are really afraid that the rebels might win. So I'm hoping, maybe totally idealistically, that some kind of a negotiated solution may come down from this, but I don't know whether it will or not. And in many cases, I would hope that exactly would be the outcome. Yeah, Ben.
It's a very thoughtful presentation, thanks. I was just thinking on from this latest discussion that protection is not the only goal that must be achieved in order to have a protection operation. Judging from what you said about how if it wouldn't be stable, if the protection could have been achieved, but it might require a long-term commitment,
right,
which is something that might have prevented people from voting for it in the first place.
Yep.
And so that it has to not only achieve its own goal,
right,
but it has to do so on the terms
yeah,
that make the goal legally supportable.
Viable over the long
So
run.
It must be both, presumably not like Iraq, not with lots of troops on the ground, and it must be short,
Yeah.
as well as achieving the protection. And maybe that's the problem for operations like Libya.
Yeah.
I imagine it could have been partitioned for quite a long time without much threat of slaughter or crimes against humanity, but no result requiring a continuation of the operation, which would not meet anybody's requirements.
Yeah. From the very beginning, the hope was that Gaddafi would, cash in his chips and cut a deal for himself of some kind of an exile, or alternatively, that his regime would collapse so quickly, everybody would get on a plane and fly to London, with bags of cash, that he could be quickly seized by the rebels. But under the view that you're raising, that okay, what's that going to be? This is a regime that had no civil society. It was very, very strange, Gaddafi's regime. And Ian Martin in New York started planning because of the view that this would have to be a longer-term engagement. And he put together, with a small team, a proposed peace-building operation that would be authorized under Chapter 7 by the Security Council, that would step in a trustee-like role, very similar to East Timor or Kosovo. And some parts of this were leaked. And it looked like the blueprint right out of East Timor or Kosovo, with major components doing police training, judiciary, armed training, economic rehabilitation, typical election a couple of years or so down the road when things would be turned back over to the Libyans. He had this whole plan worked out. And after it leaked, there was huge pushback again. This time from both G77 and, more importantly, the NTC said, look, we're going to win this battle. We're going to be the government. And so he had to throw the entire thing out the window. And then he's going to Tripoli, maybe he's there by now, with a blank slate saying, what do you want us to do for you? And it's now going to be, I suspect, a very light operation, providing advice to the NTC on their terms. And then the question that we would have, is that going to be sufficient to help assure a future stable, viable, who knows what Libya? The old American nightmare that most of our new friends are ex-Al-Qaeda, and we've even tortured some of their senior leaders, you may have read in the press. The guy who helped conquer most of Tripoli was Al-Qaeda that we rendered, tortured. He was eventually released, and now he heads up the major militia in Tripoli. And he says he loves America. thank goodness. But you can see that this has long-run question marks attached to it. And those are questions like you're raising that people are quite concerned about.